Think of the person who irritates you most right now. Not a mild discomfort. The one who genuinely gets under your skin. The colleague who keeps taking credit for work you did. Who smiles at the right people and says the right things, while you sit there knowing exactly what he is. The neighbor who lectures everyone about how they should live, whose moral certainty seems to have no bottom. The public figure whose face alone, appearing on a screen for 3 seconds, is enough to make your jaw tighten and your whole body shift into a different gear. You know the feeling. It isn't passing. It follows you out of the room and into the car and into the quiet of the evening, still burning with a heat that seems wildly out of proportion to anything that actually happened. The first instinct is always the same. The cause lives entirely outside you. That person is simply irritating. They are objectively wrong, objectively small, objectively the thing you have diagnosed them as being. The feeling is just a reasonable response to an unreasonable person. So the story goes. But sit with that reaction for a moment. Not to defend the other person, not to excuse anything they have done. Just sit with the sheer intensity of it. Why does it burn that hot? Why does the colleague who takes credit bother you more than someone who, say, cuts you off in traffic? Why does the moralizing neighbor get further under your skin than a stranger doing the same thing? The heat is information. It is pointing somewhere. And the place it is pointing is not entirely across the room. There is a principle at work here that plays out not just in kitchens and meeting rooms, but on the largest stage imaginable. Consider what happens when nations go to war. Every country, on every side of every conflict, runs the same story in its newspapers at the same time. We are the righteous ones. Our cause is just. The evil lives over there, a few miles behind the other side's lines. The enemy is cowardly. The enemy is cruel. The enemy is morally bankrupt in ways we would never be. And every newspaper in every country simultaneously prints the same story with only the names reversed. Every nation is convinced that it alone can see clearly. It is almost mathematically precise. The thing each side accuses the other of is almost always something it is also doing, has also done, or is capable of doing and knows it. The rage is not just about the other side. It is about something that cannot be admitted within one's own borders. The same mechanism that moves armies and propaganda campaigns runs continuously inside a single person sitting in a meeting or scrolling through a comment section at midnight. The capacity for it is not special. It is not the property of the cruel or the unaware. It is simply what the whole of the inner life, the known part and the part that runs on its own behind the scenes, does when it encounters something it refuses to include in its own self-portrait. It throws that something outward. It finds a face to put it on, and then it calls the feeling reality. The question is not whether the irritating person has done something real. They may well have. The question is what is being added to the reaction from inside. What extra charge is flowing into it from somewhere you haven't looked yet? That somewhere has a name. It is the part of you that runs below the waterline, the portion of your inner life that operates without announcing itself to your conscious mind. Think of the iceberg the captain never bothers to measure, not because it is small, but because it never breaks the surface, even as it does most of the steering. Everything you have ever felt, wanted, feared, or done that didn't make it into your official story of yourself, it went somewhere. It didn't dissolve. It sank. On the surface, you have what could be called the ego, not in the loose sense meaning arrogance, but the precise sense of the face you present to yourself. It is the small lit circle of what you currently know about yourself. It plans, it narrates, and because it is the part doing the narrating, it tends to write a fairly flattering account. You are the patient one, the fair-minded one, the one who would never do what that person over there just did. But the lit circle has edges. Everything outside those edges is still happening. It just isn't happening where you can see it. The qualities that got praised when you were young got pulled toward the light. The qualities that got punished, embarrassed, or declared inadmissible did not disappear. They were edited out of the self-portrait. They became the shadow. The shadow is not a moral failing. It is a structural fact about how a person is built. Every human being has one, because every human being has decided, at some point, that certain parts of themselves were too dangerous or too shameful to own. The brute who has never examined himself has one. The saint who has spent decades in contemplation has one. The difference is only in whether they have begun to look. The person without a shadow is not someone who has achieved purity. It is someone who has simply stopped looking. And that is, as it happens, statistically the most common human type. Notice what happens when the shadow grows strong. The ego's self-portrait has to be maintained. A man who has spent 40 years telling himself he is generous cannot easily sit with the recognition that he withholds things, praise, credit, love. So the contradictory material does not come up as self-knowledge. It comes up as perception. It comes up as something you noticed in someone else, something that makes you feel a heat wildly out of proportion to what the moment calls for. That is what projection does. It takes the contents of the shadow and assigns them outward, to a face, to a name, to someone who has made himself available as a screen. You attribute to another person, with complete emotional conviction, the qualities you most strongly deny in yourself. And this is not deliberate. It happens the way a fever happens. The unconscious does the projecting. The conscious mind simply wakes up to find it already in progress. The diagnostic instrument is the intensity. Cold disagreement can be a reasonable response to someone genuinely different from you. But the heat that won't leave, the rehearsal of arguments at 2 a.m, the way a name in a conversation can change the temperature of the whole room, that is a signal from below. There is an image that captures something essential here. A white man shoots a crocodile. Within minutes, a crowd arrives from the nearest village demanding compensation, because at the moment the shot was fired, an old woman in their village died, and the crocodile was her soul moving through the world. To a modern listener, this sounds remote. But before dismissing it, remember the last time someone's behavior struck you, not merely as rude, but as metaphysically wrong, as if they had violated something sacred, as if the offense had been committed not against your preferences, but against the order of things itself. Something of yours is in them. The invisible merger has already taken place, the state where you can no longer tell where your inner life ends and the other person begins. The shadow's hold is greatest in precisely the person who would most strenuously deny having one. He does not experience himself as projecting. He experiences himself as perceiving. Every piece of evidence that might challenge the self-portrait gets absorbed as further proof of his discernment. The cocoon tightens, the world recedes, and the shadow, unacknowledged, grows denser, more virulent, more in need of a face to wear. Which raises the question of what happens when that mechanism is not running inside a single person, but inside a crowd, a nation, a people that has decided, together, that its shadow belongs to someone else entirely. When that mechanism scales, when the question is not what one person projects onto one other person, but what an entire nation projects onto an entire people, the results are not merely personal tragedies, they are historical catastrophes. Consider what actually happened in the years leading up to the worst violence Europe had ever seen. There was, for a long time before anything was formalized, a kind of searching in the air. People sensed something wrong, something dark, circling, and they badly needed to know where it lived. When it finally seemed to land, when the signals could be read as pointing to one source, one group, designated as the site of all infection, there came something that, paradoxically, felt like relief. Now we know. It is over there, behind those lines, wearing those faces. And with that identification came a moral indignation so clean, so righteous, so apparently self-evident that it required no examination. The more evidence arrived, the higher the indignation climbed, and nobody noticed, not even the people whose indignation was most vocal, that their own flame was being fed from within. This is what the inner counterweight looks like when it operates at scale. The mechanism is the same one that runs inside a single person. When consciousness tilts too far in one direction, when the self-portrait becomes too spotless, the pressure underground increases. The most self-righteously moral person carries the most virulent shadow. A ship listing badly to one side has the most ballast shifting violently in the hold. At the individual level, this counterweight shows up as sleeplessness or compulsion. At the collective level, it shows up as political catastrophe. The man who eventually embodied this for 80 million people did not create their shadow, he personified it. He was unadapted, irresponsible, full of grandiosity and infantile hunger, and that is precisely why something in so many people recognized him. He was the part they had disowned, given a face and a podium. He stood up and said, "Your shadow is not yours. It belongs to them." And the relief of that offer was almost physical. He was not the cause of the nation's darkness. He was the screen onto which it had been projected, and the projection made him enormous. Before dismissing this as a lesson from a different century, it is worth watching the mechanism at its most intimate scale. A woman, devout and morally certain, married to a man she considered weak, not consciously cruel. She would have been horrified at the accusation, but her sense of her own righteousness required a receptacle for everything she could not permit herself. Slowly, without intending it, she transmitted to the person closest to her all the darkness she had sealed off from her own self-portrait. And he, without understanding what was happening, carried it, until the weight of what was not his became more than he could contain. The violence that followed came as a total shock to everyone who knew him. The catastrophe originated somewhere no one was looking. This is the anatomy of the scapegoat. It is one of the oldest rituals in human history. In its original form, literally an animal sent into the wilderness carrying the community's sins. The group loads its darkness onto a single figure, expels it, and feels temporarily clean. The trouble is that the darkness was never actually in the animal. The wilderness does not hold it. It returns, each time denser, each time in greater need of a screen. In every workplace, in every family, this ritual is still running. There is always someone who has become the problem, the difficult one, the one who, if removed, would allow everything else to function. What is rarely examined is how much of the team's own unacknowledged dysfunction has quietly been loaded onto that designation. The person may genuinely have flaws, but the heat around the designation, the speed with which others agree, the relief in the unanimity, that heat is not entirely about the person being designated. There is something inside every group that knows, somewhere below articulation, that the shadow has not dissolved. It has only found an address. And as long as it has that address, no one has to examine their own interior. The trickster, the force of raw chaos that predates every rule, retreats when the culture holds its shape. But it does not dissolve. It waits. And when the pressure underground becomes too great, it returns, and it looks for the nearest available face to wear. The problem is not that people are uniquely evil. The problem is that people are extraordinarily skilled at locating their own evil somewhere else, and extraordinarily certain, once the location has been chosen, that they are simply describing what is real. So the question becomes, what do you actually do with this? The first move is simply to notice. Not every criticism stings equally. Not every type of person bothers you with equal force. The colleague who takes credit bothers you more than the stranger who cuts you off in traffic. The family member who lies bothers you more than the stranger who have never met. There is a gradient, and the gradient is informative. The more disproportionate the reaction, the longer it follows you, the more it intrudes at 2 a.m. when nothing has provoked it, the more clearly it is signaling that something of yours is in the picture. The intensity is not proof that you are wrong about the other person. It is proof that you are not finished with yourself yet. The second move is harder. It requires sitting with a question most people find genuinely intolerable. What is the version of this quality that lives in me? Not performed with theatrical self-deprecation. Not announced publicly as an act of spiritual sophistication. Just sitting, privately, with the possibility. The colleague who takes credit, is there a part of you that wants to be seen and has been denying that want? The family member who lies. Have you been honest with yourself, fully about everything? The public figure whose very name raises your pulse. What is it, precisely, in what they represent, that touches something you have locked away? When the recognition comes, it arrives with a specific feeling. It is not guilt. Guilt is loud and performative. This is quieter, more like the air going out of something that had been held inflated for a long time. A kind of deflation followed almost immediately by relief. The heat in the reaction cools slightly, not because the other person has improved, but because the extra charge running through the reaction from inside has been acknowledged, and an acknowledged thing does not need to run on full power anymore. This is what it means to withdraw a projection. It is not an intellectual exercise where you file a report on your own subjectivity. It is a physical experience of something loosening, and it is made possible only by the willingness to look at the mirror that does not flatter, the one behind the mask you have assembled for the world. What people fear is that if they admit the darkness is theirs, they will be overwhelmed by it, or required to act on it, or judged for having it. None of these fears is accurate. A shadow that is seen can be worked with. A shadow that is denied turns the outside world into its theater. It colonizes your relationships, fills your workplace with enemies, and builds, slowly and without your noticing, a cocoon of isolation around you. The man who wasted 25 years in that cocoon was not uniquely weak or foolish. He simply could not tolerate looking at what the mirror held. And so the mirror remained behind him, and the world in front of him grew smaller and more hostile with each passing year, and he could never understand why. Shadow work is not self-punishment. It is not flagellating yourself for having a dark side. Everyone has one. That is a structural fact, not a moral failure. The work is only to acknowledge what is there, to say, yes, that impulse exists in me. It does not control me when it is known. It controls me completely when it is denied. And something shifts when this work begins, not dramatically. The person who has done some honest examination of their own shadow does not become enlightened or saintly. They become slightly more present. They can see other people slightly more clearly, not as screens onto which their own material has been cast, but as actual people with their own actual lives. The relationship improves not because the other person changed, but because the projection lifted enough to allow contact. And where genuine contact is possible, the need for power diminishes. Where love, in the broad sense of real presence with another person, can exist, the need to locate evil elsewhere weakens. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the only thing that actually changes anything. There is a mirror that does not flatter. You can avoid it for years. You can arrange your life so that it stays in your peripheral vision, never quite catching you directly, never holding your gaze long enough to show you something you did not want to see. Most people do this without deciding to. The irritating people, the infuriating ones, the ones who make your blood run fast, they are not obstacles. They are the mirror, angled at precisely the right degree to catch what you have been moving away from. Knowing this is not a catastrophe. It is not an accusation. It is an orientation. The shadow acknowledged does not become dangerous. It was already dangerous, already running. What acknowledgement does is give it a form you can see, and a thing you can see is a thing you can work with. The person who has looked honestly into that mirror is not a saint. They still have a shadow. They still project sometimes. The difference is that they have at least begun the long work of becoming themselves, not the version they decided to present, but the one they actually are. That person is slightly more capable of fairness, slightly less enslaved to the need to locate evil elsewhere, slightly more able to be present with whoever is actually standing in front of them. Where genuine presence is possible, the need for power weakens. Where the shadow is owned, the scapegoat loses his function. It is not a destination. It is a daily practice, looking into the mirror that does not flatter, and choosing, when you see something difficult, not to look away.